That human shouldn't even be alive, scoffed Gorak, squinting at the screen in disbelief. Around him, the Karyu delegation muttered in uneasy agreement. Every Deathworlder species had gathered on Z Prime, a neutral meeting ground for the few life forms tough enough to survive planets that actively sought to kill them. Brutal terrains, vicious predators, toxic atmospheres. These were familiar challenges to Karo. They thought they understood resilience. They thought they'd seen the pinnacle of endurance. And then they encountered the humans. On the main screen of the conference room, a grainy video feed played. A human, lean, scarred, and alarmingly casual, was strolling across a scorching desert under twin suns. The sensor readings flashed along the side of the screen, searing temperatures, wind speeds lethal to most species. And yet, there he was, just walking. "I don't get it," growled Iroh, a scaled Karyu warrior with a scar running from his forehead down to his jawline. He was known for his steely resolve, but right now he looked genuinely puzzled. "They aren't armoured, don't have any venom, and lack claws. What do they have? Bones?" The others nodded. Kau, proud descendants of survivalist evolution, had never encountered anything like the humans. Kara were tough, yes, built to withstand toxic environments and endure injuries that would easily incapacitate other species. They were muscular, dense, and armoured in natural plating. In short, they were the galaxy's undisputed masters of harsh living, or so they thought. One of the delegates, a scientist named Drix, piped up, clearly disturbed. "The data suggests they don't only survive on their homeworld, they thrive. Their planet, Earth, is like nothing we've ever studied." Gorak grunted, eyes never leaving the screen. "Elaborate." "Earth," Drix said, visibly trying to suppress his disbelief, "has a highly unstable environment, extreme cold and heat, unpredictable weather, active volcanic zones, vast chaotic seas. Nothing about it is hospitable, yet humans have adapted to almost every corner of it. They even go so far as to challenge it intentionally, climbing its highest mountains, swimming in its deepest waters, or venturing to its poles for entertainment." The room went silent. Entertainment. That concept was not lost on the Kyle, who relished proving their own strength, but to seek out danger on purpose. Ridiculous. "They're either insane or lying," Iroh muttered. "I thought so too," Drix admitted, "but there's more." He hesitated, as if reluctant to share the next piece of information. "Earth isn't a true death world by the strictest definition, not like Ka. The predators there are dangerous, yes, but it's not an apex world. There are no toxins in the air, no catastrophic magnetic storms." "Then why call it a death world?" someone sneered. Drix took a deep breath, tapping on his tablet. "Because humans themselves are the threat. They're aggressive in ways we don't fully understand. They don't just survive, they dominate. They form packs, create weapons, and adapt faster than any species on record. They've encountered creatures that would kill most other Deathworlders, and they've figured out ways to subdue or even befriend them." A hologram popped up, projecting images of various Earth animals, massive felines, creatures with crushing jaws, and towering mammoths. At the center of each image was a human, grinning and undaunted, standing next to these beasts as if they were allies. Gorak watched, his skepticism fading, replaced by reluctant intrigue. "You're saying they train these things?" "They don't just train them," Drix replied, voice lowering. "They make them companions. They bond with them. And it's not just beasts. Their technology, while primitive compared to ours, is modified for any environment. And it's their tenacity. They don't stop. Even when outmatched, even when injured, humans just keep going. It's like survival itself is hardwired into their instincts." The Karu exchanged glances, each warrior grappling with the realization that perhaps they had underestimated these strange beings. For as long as any of them could remember, the Karok had considered themselves a standard by which survival was measured. They were not accustomed to feeling threatened, especially not by a species without natural defences. Then the door to the chamber slid open, and the human ambassador walked in. He was nothing remarkable at first glance, about the height of a Karthok juvenile, unarmoured, with a sturdy frame that seemed laughably fragile next to the massive armoured Karthok figures in the room. But there was something unsettling in his gaze. His eyes scanned the room with a calm intensity, an unspoken confidence that unnerved the Karthok more than any weapon could. "Gentlemen," he greeted, his voice steady. He had no translator. He spoke the Karthok language fluently, a feat that took even seasoned diplomats years to master. "I appreciate the warm welcome." Iroh's lip curled as he eyed the human. "You're lucky we allowed you here, human. We don't usually waste time with soft-skinned creatures from garden planets." The human ambassador simply smiled, unfazed. "I'd imagine not. Then again, I'd wager most species don't survive long enough to have that conversation with you." That earned a few begrudging chuckles from the Karthok side, though Iroh's expression remained stony. Drix, always the scientist, couldn't resist pressing forward. "Tell us, human, how is it that your kind has endured on such a world without armour, without claws or fangs?" The ambassador shrugged as though the answer were obvious. "We adapt. We think our way out of situations. Sometimes we fight, sometimes we wait. We know that brute strength isn't everything." Iroh's brow furrowed. "Strength is survival." "Strength is survival when there's no other option," the human replied. "But on Earth, survival is just the beginning. We learn. We build. We form alliances. We take risks because it's in our nature. That's why we're here, speaking with you." The Karthok delegation exchanged wary glances. The human was bold, but he wasn't boasting. His tone was calm, steady, almost matter-of-fact. "And yet," Gorak interjected, breaking the silence, "you're mortal, breakable. If what we hear is true, your people suffer loss, pain. How do you manage such fragility?" The ambassador paused, looking genuinely contemplative, as though this question went beyond mere physical limitations. He seemed to be searching for a way to explain something deeper. "We suffer, yes," he finally said, "but that suffering drives us. It's what makes us push forward, to protect what we have. We fight because of it, and we build because of it. Our mortality reminds us that every second counts, that life is precious, and that's what gives us strength." Gorak's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. The words made him uneasy. Karthok had long dismissed emotions as weaknesses, things that clouded survival instincts, but the human was saying the opposite. That fragility was a source of resilience. It was a notion that gnawed at the edges of Karthok pride. Before anyone else could respond, a junior Karthok warrior who had been standing guard stepped forward. "Enough of this talk," he snarled, impatience evident in his voice. "Let's see if this human is as tough as he claims." The room stilled. A challenge on Karthok terms was no small matter. The human ambassador met the young warrior's stare without flinching. "I didn't come here to prove anything," he said, but then a glint sparked in his eye. "However, I'm not one to turn down a demonstration." Gorak raised a hand, signalling for silence. This was not part of the planned diplomatic exchange, and yet he couldn't deny the curiosity burning within him. The Karthok warriors cleared a space in the centre of the room, forming a loose circle around the human and the young challenger, whose name was Karg. Karg was infamous among the Karthok ranks for his speed and strength. Even his elders watched him with a mix of pride and wariness. The idea of matching a human against him was almost laughable. The human ambassador shrugged off his jacket and stepped into the circle, wearing only a simple shirt and pants, clearly unimpressed by the hulking warrior sizing him up. "All right, Karg," he said almost casually. "How do you want to do this?" "Play this," Karg growled, cracking his knuckles with a sickening sound that resonated through the room. Survive, he sneered, as if that alone would be impossible. He crouched, muscles rippling under his armor plating, his sharp gaze fixed on the human, ready to strike. The Karok watched in silence, some in anticipation, others with pity for the human who seemed oblivious to the challenge he was facing. This wasn't just a test. It was almost a ritual among the Karok, a way to assert dominance and put other species in their place. But the human didn't flinch. Kag lunged, a blur of armoured muscle and raw power. He swung a fist the size of a boulder, aiming directly for the human's chest, fully expecting to send him flying across the room. But the human sidestepped smoothly, moving with an agility that caught Kag off guard. Kag whirled around, eyes narrowing. He charged again, this time faster, a blur of limbs and brute force. The human dodged each swing, every movement measured and precise. Kag's attacks were relentless, but the human slipped out of each one, his expression calm, almost amused. The Karok warriors began murmuring, some exchanging skeptical glances. This wasn't the outcome they had anticipated. The human was outmatched in strength. Yet somehow he was holding his ground, manoeuvring around Kag's attacks with unsettling ease. Kag, panting and visibly frustrated, threw a vicious punch aiming for the human's face. But this time, the human didn't dodge. Instead, he stepped forward, catching Kag's wrist and twisting it, using the Karok's own momentum against him. Kag staggered, eyes wide with shock as he was forced off balance. The room fell into stunned silence. The human released Kag and took a step back, watching him recover. "Strength isn't everything, remember," he said, his voice cool and even. "Sometimes it's about knowing when and where to strike." Kag let out an enraged snarl, lunging forward in a final reckless assault. But the human ducked low, pivoted on his heel, and swung his leg around in a sweeping motion. His foot caught Kag's ankle, and with a heavy thud, the towering Karok warrior crashed to the ground. The Karok stared, jaws slack, as their fiercest young warrior lay sprawled on the floor. The human extended a hand toward Kag, who glared at him with a mix of shame and fury. After a tense moment, Kag grabbed the human's hand, allowing himself to be pulled up, the young warrior muttering something under his breath, grudging respect flickering in his eyes. The human ambassador turned back to the delegation, brushing off the dust from his shirt. "So, do I pass the test?" Gorak, who had watched the entire display in stunned silence, finally broke into a slow nod. Perhaps we underestimated you," he admitted, his voice tinged with reluctant respect. Drix, the scientist, seemed equally shaken. "You moved as though you could read his attacks before they happened. Is that training?" The human smiled, a faint glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "Let's just say humans have learned to adapt quickly. We may not have natural armor, but we compensate with skill and strategy." The Karok exchanged wary glances. They had seen warriors with exceptional skill, but this was different. It wasn't just training, it was a calculated response to overwhelming force, an understanding of how to exploit even the smallest of advantages. The human had faced a Karok warrior and hadn't just survived, he had won. Gorak grunted, a look of consideration crossing his face. "Impressive, human. But tell me, why do your people develop these skills? You said your world isn't a true death world. What need is there to hone such abilities?" The human leaned against the edge of the meeting table, his expression thoughtful. "Earth might not be a death world by your standards, but survival there isn't always easy. We face challenges, both from the environment and from each other, and in a way that makes us unpredictable." The room fell silent again. The Karok prided themselves on being prepared for any threat, any challenge. But unpredictability, that was new, something outside their usual framework of strength and endurance. The human continued, his voice steady and calm. "We've learned that adaptation isn't just about the physical. It's about how we think, how we approach problems, and how we can change our strategies when things don't go as planned. The younger Karthoks shifted uneasily, while the older warriors watched with narrowed eyes. For them, the world had always been simple. Strength meant survival. But this human spoke of survival as something else entirely, a complex web of thought and action. And in that moment, they began to see him and his people in a new light. One of the older Karthok delegates, a seasoned warrior with countless battles under his belt, spoke up, his tone skeptical. If humans are as resourceful as you say, why haven't you dominated the galaxy already? Why haven't you sought to conquer and control other worlds? The human's eyes met the warrior's, unblinking. It's not about control, he said simply. It's about coexistence. We don't need to dominate others to feel strong. We understand the value of cooperation, of alliances. It's what keeps us growing, evolving. Because alone, we're vulnerable. Together, we're unstoppable. The words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the Karthok way of thinking. Cooperation was seen as a weakness, a crutch for those who couldn't stand alone. But for humans, it seemed it was a strength, a form of resilience that went beyond brute force. Drix's analytical mind raced as he considered this perspective. So you're saying humans use cooperation as a form of survival? The human nodded. Exactly. We understand our limits. We know that there are things we can't accomplish alone, and we're willing to admit that. By working together, we overcome obstacles that would otherwise be impossible. The Karthok mulled over this, each one processing the implications. To admit weakness, to rely on others, that went against everything they had been taught. Yet here was a creature from a so-called lesser world, standing before them alive and victorious, speaking of unity as though it were a shield as strong as any armour. Finally, Gorak spoke again, his tone measured. Perhaps there is more to humans than we realized. You possess strength, even if it's not the kind we understand. You have earned our respect. The human ambassador inclined his head, accepting the gesture with quiet dignity. Thank you. Respect is mutual. I came here not to challenge, but to learn. And maybe, if we're open to it, we can both walk away stronger. The Karthok delegation fell silent, each member deep in thought. For the first time, they considered that strength might not be as simple as they had believed. Strength, the human had shown them, could take many forms, and perhaps even the greatest Deathworlders had something to learn. But the meeting was not over yet, and the human ambassador still had one more message to deliver. The human ambassador stood in silence, sensing he had finally earned the Karthok's attention, but he knew his next words would challenge them even further. Before I leave, he said, looking around the room, there's something else you should know about Earth. He paused, letting the weight of his statement settle. Humans aren't the only dangerous species there. The Karthok stirred, shifting their massive forms as they glanced at each other. Gorak narrowed his eyes, a trace of suspicion in his gaze. Explain, he said cautiously. The ambassador continued, his tone still calm but carrying an edge. Earth is home to countless species that would be considered lethal on any other planet. Our oceans alone are filled with creatures whose venom or strength could bring down a Karthok. There are predators in our jungles that hunt in packs, creatures in our mountains that strike without warning, and plants that can immobilize or poison you with a touch. Kag snorted, clearly unconvinced. So you share your world with beasts? We all do. The ambassador smiled, a faint, knowing expression that only deepened the Karthok's curiosity. True, he conceded, but on Earth we don't just live among these creatures. We've learned to coexist, sometimes to tame them, sometimes to avoid them, and when necessary, to defeat them. We aren't the strongest beings on our planet, and we aren't the fastest, but we survive because we've adapted to understand them. We've even managed to harness their strength to our advantage." Drix's eyes widened, the scientist's mind visibly racing as he absorbed the implications. "You mean you use these creatures as weapons? Allies?" The ambassador nodded. "In a way, for centuries humans have partnered with animals that would otherwise be our enemies. We ride beasts that can outrun any human, hunt with creatures that can smell prey from miles away, and use others to navigate the harshest terrains. Earth's life forms aren't just threats, they're part of our survival strategy." The Karok exchanged wary glances. This was something entirely foreign to their worldview. Karok didn't collaborate with other creatures. They dominated, controlled, or destroyed anything that stood in their way. But here was a species from a supposedly lesser world describing an entirely different approach. Gorak folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "Why tell us this, human? Why share these secrets with a people you barely know?" The ambassador met his gaze steadily. "Because I believe we have more in common than you think. You Karok understand strength better than any species in the galaxy, but what if that strength could grow even greater through unity? Humans learned long ago that true power doesn't come from conquering alone. It comes from understanding, from seeing potential where others see threats." The room fell into a contemplative silence. The Karok were unaccustomed to introspection, to thinking beyond survival and dominance. But the humans' words stirred something within them, a glimmer of curiosity and even possibility. Finally, one of the elder Karok, a battle-scarred veteran named Cruel, stepped forward. His voice was rough, filled with the wisdom of countless campaigns. "And what would humans seek in return for such cooperation? Power? Territory?" The ambassador shook his head, smiling slightly. "We seek allies. We seek understanding. Strength is different on every world, and it takes many forms. Perhaps Karok and humans have something to learn from each other. We're not asking you to change. We're offering you the chance to expand your strength, to see what might be possible together." Craig's expression softened, his fierce pride tempered by a new perspective. "You mean to say there is strength in acknowledging our limits, in recognizing what others can offer?" The ambassador nodded, sensing the impact of his words. "Exactly. Even the mightiest of us have something to gain from an ally, something to protect beyond ourselves. It doesn't make us weak. It makes us adaptable." The concept hung heavy in the air, a potent challenge to everything the Karok had believed. For so long, their culture had been centered on self-reliance, on an unyielding code of strength. But this human had shown them that strength could be broadened, that there were other ways to grow without compromising who they were. Gorak, who had remained silent for a time, finally spoke, his voice calm, measured. "This cooperation, it would be an experiment, a partnership with boundaries. We would not compromise our ways or submit to outside influence." The ambassador inclined his head. "Of course, this isn't about control, it's about possibilities, and the galaxy is wide enough for both our ways to thrive." The Karok stood in contemplative silence. This human had come to them as a diplomat, yet he had done what no other had managed before. He had challenged their perception of strength without diminishing it. He had met them on their own terms, survived their trial, and shown them an alternative path that did not insult their pride. Finally, Gorak extended his hand, a rare gesture among Karok, a symbol of respect and acceptance. "Then we shall see where this path leads, human. May our partnership bring strength to us both." The ambassador took his hand, gripping it firmly as equals. "May it make us both stronger." The room exhaled, the tension easing into a newfound respect. The Karok, for the first time, considered humans not as fragile beings, but as something much more formidable. A species that had mastered a different kind of resilience, one that held its own against even the most dangerous of worlds. As they parted ways, Each side knew they had taken the first step toward a new understanding. The Karok had encountered a challenge they hadn't anticipated, a reminder that even the fiercest warriors had something to learn. And the human ambassador left knowing that humanity had gained an ally, one that understood strength in a way no other species could. The galaxy, he thought, had just become a little less lonely and a lot more interesting.